Good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Paikin. Paula's Hot is off tonight. We welcome you to this special Friday edition of Studio 2.
And the world has changed so drastically that nothing less than radical reform to the school system is necessary.
The 1995 Royal Commission on Learning, the blueprint for educational reform in Ontario.
We really tried to implement the things that we could implement. We were obviously living in the economic conditions at the time. Good idea, bad idea, it really didn't matter, we didn't have the money.
And in some ways what we think we're doing really is finishing the business of the Royal Commission.
Education in Ontario, 10 years of turmoil and change, a special edition of Studio 2. Standardized tests, a new curriculum, student codes of conduct, province-wide report cards, a college of teachers to ensure more accountability for teachers. These are all relatively new features of Ontario's education system because 10 years ago this month, one of the most important education studies ever recommended they happen. The Royal Commission on Learning offered a blueprint to radically reform the system because too many parents, students, and educators thought it wasn't working nearly well enough. 10 years after those landmark recommendations, we'll spend the next hour asking, how are we doing?
And the world has changed so drastically that nothing less than radical reform to the school system is necessary.
The NDP government created the Royal Commission on Learning because of mounting concern over the state of Ontario's education system. Increasingly, many parents said they wanted to see a back-to-basics approach to learning. In 1995, the Commission presented its report, complete with 167 recommendations, including developing a centralized curriculum set by the province, province-wide literacy and numeracy tests for grades 3 and 11, teacher recertification every 5 years, early childhood education beginning with children as young as 3, the elimination of grade 13, and the creation of school councils that would include parents, teachers, and community members.
We now have a blueprint for change that will help us to rebuild Ontario's education system to meet both the needs of students as well as the concerns of parents and educators.
For the most part, the recommendations were well received.
I'm very positive. I think it will benefit the students in Ontario.
We've had what I call a warm and fuzzy and a rather mushy and soft educational system in Ontario for 25 years. And this is one of the first indications that there's a dramatic shift underway.
In the weeks following the report's release, Bob Rae's government did begin to implement many of the recommendations, including the centralized curriculum and mandatory school councils.
We are determined to not allow this report to gather dust, that we intend to move very quickly.
But 6 months after the report's release, the NDP were turfed out of office by Mike Harris's common sense revolution. Reducing the $11 billion deficit became the new government's prime goal. And so, over the next 8 years, only about a quarter of the Commission's recommendations were adopted. John Snoblin was the Conservative government's first education minister.
We really tried to implement the things that we could implement. We were obviously living in the economic conditions at the time, and so some of the things like very early childhood education just couldn't be anticipated in the budget that we had. Good idea, bad idea, it really didn't matter, we didn't have the money.
The current education minister says Ontario is now well positioned to adopt many more of the Royal Commission's recommendations.
I mean, we used a lot of the Royal Commission's insights for our policy, and we came to government with a very clear, very detailed policy of what we're doing. And in some ways what we think we're doing really is finishing the business of the Royal Commission.
10 years after the Royal Commission on Learning published its recommendations, is the school system that 95% of Ontario students attend really any better? Here to kickstart our special one-hour discussion, Jerry Kaplan, one of the co-chairs of the Royal Commission on Learning. Dave Cook, the NDP education minister who struck the Royal Commission in the first place and began to implement many of its recommendations. Janet Ecker, who 10 years ago did not know that she would soon become education minister in Mike Harris's Conservative government and have this responsibility fall into her lap. And Sean Conway, a former education minister who 10 years ago watched the Royal Commission report from his seat as a Liberal opposition member. Welcome everybody to TVO. Looking forward to this discussion. I normally start with the guest, Jerry, but since he hired you, I'm going to start with him to find out what the things were like at the time that required your hiring. What did you see that either was or was not happening in education at the time that required the creation of this Royal Commission in the first place?
Well, I think your lead-in piece covered it pretty well. I mean, there was a lot of divisions within the province as to whether the system was too mushy, whether the system was, whether the curriculum was, whether we needed to have a province-wide curriculum, and whether there should be accountability and so forth. So I think there was a lot of that controversy in the province. I remember when we were leading up to the appointment and to developing the terms of reference, we did 8 or 10 communities. We had community meetings across the province. And I was shocked. The first one I went to in Ottawa, 1,200 people showed up to tell me what they thought should be in the terms of reference for a Royal Commission. So the interest on the ground was amazing, and Royal Commission was a good way to go in terms of trying to bring the community together and see if a consensus could be developed.
How quickly did it become apparent to you, Jerry, that the consensus out there was going to be rather difficult to grab onto?
About 20 minutes.
20 minutes in.
Yeah. I was astonished. I didn't know much about the consultations that Dave and the government had. I had no particular link with education at the time, although my son was, I think, in grade 8 in an Ottawa public school. And I had no sense that things were as fragmented and as conflictual as they proved to be. And we spent the entire year and a half spreading the word that our report was going to be very difficult and maybe even divisive because there were so many strongly held differences of opinion.
Well, one of the things I wanted to know at the time when I was covering it, and maybe you can tell me now, is NDP government, NDP loyalist as the chair of this thing, teacher unions, you know, usually deeply supportive of the NDP, very much involved in the whole education system. Did he ever say to you, do us a favor, we're in hip deep with the social contract and ticking these guys off, please go easy on them?
No. No.
That never happened?
Never. I made it clear to Dave, and I think in the end he wasn't as happy as he could have been by my determination to stay with what I had said to him, that if we weren't independent, if there were not only a hint of interference by the government, but if a reality of interference, that our credibility would be lost. And I was determined to the end not to be. We met very rarely. We met with the deputy minister very rarely. We met the premier never at all. We were a very ornery, independent group, or at least I was. And we weren't a very, while the co-chair was a card-carrying Liberal and a Liberal cabinet minister, to this day I couldn't tell you how the other 3 of the 5 members would have voted on any given election.
You're talking about Monique Bégin, who's the former Liberal health minister.
But the other 3 don't know anything but their politics, never rose, still...
Steve, just on the times, too, I think one of the things that's important to reflect, it was 1994. Well, in the previous 10 or 12 years, the Davis government, under the leadership of Betty Stevenson, had made a major improvement, reform around special education. The Peterson government was involved, as was the Davis government, with separate school extension, completion. There was a major initiative in the mid to late 80s to implement French language governance and changes at that level. So if you look from about 1980 through to 1993, the public school system in Ontario had been asked to accept a very significant amount of real change, and implementing that change, I think, was perhaps as positive as that change was conceptually. Implementing things like the minority language entitlement, the creation of French language boards, the separate school completion, the dramatic changes in special education in the 1980s were not small undertakings. So by the mid-1990s, I think there was a sense that and rightly so, that public education was a rather different-looking creature than it was 15 or 20 years before.
I want to go into the 4 key areas of interest that you ultimately made 167 recommendations on, and I'll ask our director to bring these up just so we can see them here. The 4 key areas were early childhood education, which everybody told you was crucial. New school community alliances, because parents felt so out of touch with their schools and their communities. Information technology, which was a pretty sexy thing 10 years ago about getting more computers in the classroom, and the professionalization of teaching. Now, we're going to start talking about the first one, and through the course of the program, we'll get around to the other 3 as well. You recommended, Jerry, that all school boards offer early childhood education programs for kids between 3 and 5 for parents who wanted it. What motivated that recommendation?
Evidence.
Evidence that what?
Evidence that it worked, that it made a tremendous and dramatic difference in the life of children's later learning patterns if they could be at an early age introduced to some kind of appropriate, expert-led, not sitting in their desks and learning the way you do later on, but just interacting with their peers in a way that a professional teacher could take them through, learning to play, learning to sense, learning to ask questions. And the evidence was so overwhelming. Let me tell you, I knew nothing about it. Let me tell you explicitly, because this became an issue, it was a completely unideological proposition for our group. We did the research. We had some people at OISE do more research. We read the hundreds of studies that have been done. Everybody in the entire world agreed that this was a major, who didn't have an ideological axe to grind.
This is where I bring Janet Eckert in, because not everybody agreed. And one of your fellow commissioners, Avis Glaze, said, well, here's what, after Mike Harris became premier, he apparently told Avis Glaze, that recommendation, early childhood education, is the stupidest idea I've ever heard.
He said it publicly to the media.
Why did the premier feel that way, Janet?
Well, I think there's a big debate about how you provide that early education learning for children. And there's no question, I mean, Jerry's quite right, that providing children at an early age with the ability to learn so that they're ready to go to school, all of those things are really, really important. But I think what was important to Premier Harris was that you also recognized that not every child was able to, or it was appropriate for every child at the age of 2 or 3 to go to a sort of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday regulated child care center. And so I think that was one of the challenges, was how, and the commission quite frankly talked about choice. And so how do you build a child care support out there that provides appropriate choice, that gives the support to both parents and children, because some parents are quite capable of providing that to their children, some aren't, and so you need to have a system that is flexible. But the other thing, though, I think that to remember, in 1995, when the Harris government came in, and John Snoblin made mention of it, one of the biggest pressures that we had in the first couple of years was the fiscal pressure, and I know the current government likes to think they're facing some sort of problem with $5 billion. We had an $11 billion pressure. We were going into debt $1 million more an hour every hour of the day. That's right. So for us, in the first year or two, that was one of the first priorities. But then we moved forward with a lot of those recommendations because we agreed with them. They were part of our education policy. What Dave did with the Royal Commission, I think it has set the stage for education reform for the last decade. It's been very good.
This is one area, though, that we have not made much progress in Ontario. Our government announced a number of pilot projects for 3-year-old programs. Because of fiscal problems, would love to have left a broader universal program as a legacy, but it just costs too much. But to show you how far we've fallen behind, in Arkansas, it's mandatory to start school at age 5, and they have a universally accessible program for 3- and 4-year-olds.
Oh, you know why?
In Arkansas.
Bill Clinton was governor.
Well, I know, but I mean, we're talking about a southern state where a lot of people would put their halos on in Canada and say, that's United States, that's southern United States, they just don't do those things. Here we don't even have full-day JK in kindergarten.
Steve, well, after the commission report, I did a whole series of open line shows and discovered what somehow we had missed during the commission, that there was this profound divide within Ontario, and we got call after call of people, Janet, who said this was some kind of communist plot. It was literally true, in which the government wanted to steal the minds of little kids before their parents had a chance to inculcate local values. And I was astonished, and that, of course, was the growing neoconservatism that manifested itself in that way. Then one of the astonishing moments in your government was when you guys appointed Fraser Mustard and former Lieutenant Governor
Margaret McCain,
yes, to do a study on something the Prime Premier had said was the stupidest idea he had ever heard. And I went down and visited them, and once they were appointed, they got no support. They didn't have computers. They hardly had telephones that worked. And in the end, they did a report that said exactly what everybody knew they would say, that this is the greatest single thing since sliced bread. And there were a couple of pilot projects, and then it was once again.
Steve, I just wanted to make a point here that